Chaos is calling, and it's time to delve into the darker points of history that inspired the Legions of Chaos. We talked about the Loyalist chapters a few weeks ago and a lot of the history that inspired them, but today I want to dive into the Chaos Legions and talk about the darker side of history that inspired a lot of these factions and where they came from, and some of the cool ways that you can incorporate these into your builds and gameplay. As many of us Warhammer 40K fans are aware, Games Workshop is famous for speaking inspiration everywhere. They pull from various different IPs and history to really bring us an in-depth look at humanity. They often define themselves as satire in a grimdark universe and in a grimdark fashion. Satire, for most people, means haha funny stuff to represent what's going on, but in reality, satire has been dark for a long time. A lot of Greek tragedies are a satirical review of their culture at the time and the people and places that needed to be criticized at that point in history. Things like the Odyssey were really good examples of this. There was a lot of critique in there about leadership in Greece and how factions could be pulled in a whim to a war that really didn't actually matter at the time. And this type of satire is what Games Workshop strives for. They pull these points in history and even in some cases modern times to bring to life these factions that we know and love in science fiction. This is a long tradition for science fiction authors and creators, and today I want to talk about the chaos inspirations for that. But before we dive into that, we have our sponsor today who actually helped me create this video in depth. You guys may not have noticed lately, but I've been working on leveling up my YouTube channel to a whole new level, and because of that, the tool I've been using to do that has reached out to me and actually wants to affiliate with me, which is wonderful. And that is vidIQ. vidIQ is a software that specializes in leveling up your YouTube channel. It's been a long YouTube journey for me, and I'm not here because I want to blow up and become YouTube famous. That's not what I want. I'm here because I like to share my passion for Warhammer 40K lore and talk about the things I can't really talk about with my friends. A lot of my friends who play Warhammer 40K are a lot more casual than I am when it comes to lore, and being able to do these deep dives and talk about lore accurate armies and things like that isn't something I can do in my daily life. So I'm here. And because of that, I wanted to find all of you guys that are the same way. And that's what drove me to vidIQ. vidIQ is an amazing tool that gives you access to thumbnail idea generators, script outline generators, which we're actually using for this current video. It also helps you with a lot of the back-end stuff, things like tags and keywords and making sure your descriptions are accurate and detailed. All these little things are little minor tricks that help me find more of you. In the last few months since I've started doing this, I've had multiple videos reach over 5,000 people, which beforehand, if you go look even a year ago, I was reaching maybe 100 if it was a good video. So vidIQ has really made a difference and helped me refine my skills through various trainings and tools so that I can share my videos and my love with you guys. So if this is something that intrigues you, if you want to be able to share your videos and your interests with more of the general public, there's a link down in my description that will take you to an awesome affiliate site and help you guys get set up. There are free options as well as different paid options that you can do, and I definitely recommend checking them out and figuring out what's best for you. Now let's get back to the video that vidIQ helped me create. The first legion we're going to talk about is probably the easiest layup for historical inspiration, and that's probably not the legion you're thinking of. There's several different Chaos Legions that do pull deeply from history itself, but there's one that pulls from a very specific time in history, and its Primarch pulls from very specific people. And that's actually the Emperor's Children. The Emperor's Children are a very specific example of the fall of Rome. This hasn't been acknowledged in detail by Games Workshop themselves, but the almost one-to-one way that the Emperor's Children show this in a sci-fi universe with corrupt gods and chaos is astounding. Their gradual fall, including the destruction of their legions by a corruption that they bring into themselves, is a really good example of how Rome fell. The legions fell historically not because they weren't the best. They fell because they let in a bunch of outsiders who often betrayed them or were nowhere near as good as their legions and refused to live up to that quality and expectation that the legions had for themselves. So by running their armies to the point where I believe it was 60 to 70% of their army was auxilia at the time of Rome's greatest falls, it corrupted, sapped, and destroyed the Roman legion. On top of that, by having the foreigners and second-class citizens doing all of the work for them, they allowed themselves to grow decadent in Rome itself and in the Italian peninsula. They stopped doing the work for themselves. They allowed slavery and second-class citizenship to be the working class, the ones who were creating, the ones who were arming people, and are doing most of the work. And throughout all of this, Rome and Rome's leadership would party. They'd seek every access possible. We see this with Nero and Caligula and several of the other emperors throughout this time period. And this is reflected almost directly with the Emperor's Children. It's one that I don't hear as often in discussions when we're talking about the Emperor's Children. Oftentimes I hear them referenced in several different groups like the Knights Templar and things like that that have great falls that happen very quickly. But in my opinion, that's not exactly correct. The Emperor's Children are a gradual fall as they give into their excesses and let the corruption seep in. And because of this, we get to see their fall to detailed excess, and Fulgrim and his passion desire for perfection, which is something that we often saw noted with Caligula and Nero, be the thing that actually creates their largest corruption. Because of this, they are probably the easiest to define themselves. The next one's going to be kind of similar. They're not as easy because they pull from more than one location, but they're still quite easy to define as well. So, the Sons of Angron are pretty simple to understand as well when it comes to their historical references. The main one we see specifically through Angron himself is Spartacus and the rise of Spartacus. His story mirrors Spartacus almost one-to-one, but you had lasers and jet bikes and a few things like that to get what we have today. Angron is a fascinating character, and his story is so tragic because the story of Spartacus is very tragic as well. Now, this isn't a straight one-to-one ripoff as much as it is a very deep inspiration, and I love that about Angron. This is the reason he's one of my personal favorite Traitor Primarchs, because you actually understand why he did what he did. And I think I'd do the same thing if I were in his shoes. Giving into his rage fully might be a little extreme for me, but most of what he did made sense for anyone who was in his shoes. He had no right to trust the Emperor. The Emperor literally forced him to watch his friends die when he could have saved them. And he did save most of the others. He saved Mortarian's friends and their rebellion. He saved Horus and his friends. He saved most of the other Primarchs' allies in their times of need. Some of them didn't need saving, obviously, like the Khan and the Lion, but those who needed it, he was there for them if he found them in time. And because of that, it's understandable. I understand why Angron hated the Emperor. It makes complete sense. And I don't feel bad for him. And we see this inspiration throughout most of his legion. We see a lot of that gladiatorial feel and the way they do things. The fun part with them is they also have a lot of Aztec inspiration, and the Aztec blood wars were major parts of history as well. The Aztecs believed that human sacrifice was key to most of their rituals. So things like collecting skulls and sacrificing people to their gods through blood was common. So having Khorne be very blood and skull driven makes him very much like the loose definition of an Aztec god. And it makes sense why a lot of the jackals and the berserkers will sacrifice human beings to Khorne themselves in order to get more power. It's why the Bloodletters do what they do, and it really builds this fascinating foundation of a story between the gladiator side and the Aztec blood worship side. So I know historically a lot of the things the Aztecs did is questionable because the sources are questionable. That is valid. But we're talking about the inspiration pulled here, and Games Workshop writers aren't deep historians with a lot of knowledge of the potential Aztec fallacies. They probably read National Geographic, and that's what inspired them. We see this a lot with writers throughout history, including myself, where we'll look at history and go, I wonder what happens if this were in space, and then we put our own twist on it. That's really, really common. A lot of your favorite stories are this way. So the fact that Games Workshop did take these couple aspects and turn them into a legion makes complete sense. It's one of my favorite legions. I don't actually own them. I don't play them on the tabletop either. I might eventually, but they aren't the legion that really gels with the way I want to play. But they are one that I really love, and I think the historical basis for them is fantastic. The Third Legion is one that I am very familiar with. They're one that I've painted and prepared and deep dove the lore so that I can understand them better, and that is the Thousand Sons. The Thousand Sons are a really interesting group when it comes to historical context. The nature of who they are is pulled from several different parts of the globe. For example, Prospero isn't Egyptian themed. A lot of the legends and things that it's built on are actually Atlantis. They're Greek. A lot of how Prospero is described is far more familiar to Athens than it is to Cairo or Alexandria. Alexandria is probably the closest you're going to get, but Alexandria is a Greek city that was built in Egypt. So in reality, Alexandria is probably going to be your best bet. They do have a lot of the Egyptian aesthetic, which Alexandria did, because the Greeks found it fascinating. So things like scarabs and the Egyptian style architecture and design make a lot of sense when it comes to the Thousand Sons. But the Thousand Sons aren't really uniquely that. A lot of their magic systems and Magnus himself pull far more from the Northern European way of mythology and legend. For example, Magnus's giving of his eye to save his son is very similar to Odin giving his eye to find the knowledge to save his family. This lore is really fascinating, and I love how they pulled from so many different elements to really build the Thousand Sons to what they are. And I think they're a good example of how you can mash several cultures together to come out with an entirely new one that gives us an even better story for what we're trying to tell. From this point, though, we're actually going to move on to some that were a lot harder to define. So stick with me. There's going to be a little bit more stretching to fit them into historical elements, but I think you guys are going to enjoy it. The Death Guard are a really interesting one for historical ties. There's a lot of different branches that come into them. There's a lot of Ottoman culture that comes in, but most of their fighting styles and things like that are really the eastern fronts of World War I. A lot of times when we talk about World War I, we're talking about deep trench warfare that was very stagnant and didn't move throughout most of France. But the reality was there was kind of two different wars going on. A lot of times the armies were the same, but depending on where you were fighting very different styles. And these two different styles were very different in nature. The static trench formations and fortifications and digging and sapping happened a lot in the west on the more open plains of France and a little bit into Germany and Belgium. But as soon as we get up into the mountains and those areas that have deep fields and woods, the fighting style changed, and it's one that is more familiar to what we'd see in World War II, where men would be in small foxholes and then would move through the forest with cover. But at the time, it wasn't just smoke and weather that they would use for that cover. They were often using different types of mustard gas and chlorine gases and things like that to eliminate the enemy before they got there. So this poison nature of the Death Guard, as well as that slow plodding advance using heavy, thick armor, is very reminiscent of Germany and Hungary and Austria during this part of World War I. Along that eastern front that we're often fighting with Russia or with many of those different nations that were part of the Entente. And I love this connection to Mortarion as well, because during this time in World War One, the nature of the fighting, as well as all of the gases, would regularly drift into civilian territory and would kill a lot of people. So the kind of dark gothic aesthetic and representation of the Grim Reaper became very popular back then and in that area. So having Mortarion be that personification of the Angel of Death really is fascinating and well done by Games Workshop. I have to give them a lot of credit for the Death Guard. They went a lot deeper into this than a lot of people think. The next Legion is another one that's pretty obvious. That is the Alpha Legion. The Alpha Legion represents modern spycraft and warfare, not the James Bond style. That isn't really represented by the Alpha Legion. They're far more the CIA and the clandestine works of the Cold War. We see them, the CIA as well as the KGB, tied into the Alpha Legion quite a bit. We get to see that almost mustache-twirling villain type of approach to spycraft that a lot of the more questionable sides of intelligence did. And to be fair, I can't just rag on the KGB. They did terrible things. They did a lot of this stuff as well. But there were several instances that the CIA and MI6 did things that were equally bad. And the not being sure whose side you're on is very true of the CIA even to this day. If you watch the news here in America, you often see people questioning whether the CIA was involved in this scandal or that scandal, or whether they were tied to this other intelligence agency to do this here in America. And that's because the CIA famously got caught with their hands in the cookie jar repeatedly, to the point where no one really trusts them anymore. And this is exactly what we were talking about in the beginning with satire. This is a very satirical representation of these organizations, MI6 and the CIA and the KGB, not being trusted by literally anyone and no one really knowing whose side they're on. Oftentimes, during the Cold War, there was actually instances in the late Cold War that there would be two sides being funded by the CIA that were fighting each other somewhere in Africa or deep in Southeast Asia. And neither side realized they were being funded by the same organization, and the CIA didn't even realize they were being funded by the same organization. The CIA would often have one team doing one thing and one team doing another, not realizing that they had actually pointed their different factions against each other instead of targeting the KGB that were in the area. So this leads to a lot of fun and a lot of satire that we get to really enjoy when it comes to the Alpha Legion. The next is a pretty easy one for people who are big history buffs like me, but may not be common knowledge to a lot of people. And that is the Night Lords. The Night Lords are a very specific representation of a time in history that nowadays is kind of forgotten. Not a lot of people like to talk about it for various different reasons. But during a long stretch of time when England and France were constantly at war with each other, and there was a political power struggle going on in Germany every 5 minutes, the world was at war. And it was a war between two major religions that had been at war for, at this point, nearly 500 years. And that is the war between the Ottomans and the Eastern European Christian bloc. And this bloc was led by Vlad the Impaler. Vlad the Impaler was the king of Transylvania and was famous for his sheer brutality. His nation was in constant turmoil because they were on the borders with the Ottomans. The Ottomans were doing everything they could to sneak in and deceive people and run any type of sneaky operation to destabilize them, because Transylvania controlled one of the only passes into the Western world. And the Ottomans really, really wanted to get to the wealth of Italy and Germany and Austria and all of those countries to the west. So a lot of the Catholic world did support Vlad the Impaler, but this war was brutal and lasted for a very long time, with a lot of people dying in ways that are not okay to be talking about on this platform. And because of this, it led to the inspiration for the Night Lords that I really love. And Vlad the Impaler is basically the ancient version of Konrad Curze. Konrad Curze is, by definition, the exact same story that we see with Vlad the Impaler. Vlad the Impaler wasn't really a noble when he rose. He was a little bit higher class, but because he was a very good soldier and a very good politician, he managed to climb the ranks. And soon everyone relied on him, and he had absolute power. He would very famously do very terrible things to anyone who committed a crime at all, and anyone who tried to infiltrate his country got even worse. So this inspiration led to Konrad Curze quite straight one-to-one, and the way the Night Lords fight is the same thing that the armies of Vlad the Impaler would do if they ever cut off a Muslim force from the Ottomans, or if they decided to move forward and attack one of the Ottoman cities. They would often sack it, pillage it, and leave it burned to the ground and covered in salt, carrying off literally everyone except for one survivor. This was a common practice for this sect during this time, because they wanted to make it clear to the much more powerful Ottomans that coming too close costs a lot, and you have to be willing to sacrifice every bit of that to get through. Now, eventually, the Ottomans actually ended up finding a way around them instead of through them, and did end up trying to sack Vienna, but in the end, they actually didn't succeed, because they had to go a much longer way. Their supply routes were much more difficult to maintain, and the Europeans were able to actually strike at those and slow them down. But all of this happened because of Vlad the Impaler and his sheer brutality, which is echoed much, much later in the Night Lords. The next legion is the legion that is my personal favorite. Once again, I still have not built them. I have almost built them like 30 times now, and I think they will be the next full army I do. If you see over my shoulder, you can see a lot of gray over there. That is because I'm reworking my white scars. Almost a third of the army went to Legends, and we got a bunch of new cool stuff. So I'm starting work on them, and we'll be working on them for a while. But after they're done, as well as House Hestia, which is only about a quarter painted, I'm going to be tackling the Iron Warriors eventually. I need to find a place to put them in this room. There's not much of that, but I'm looking forward to seeing everything that they can do on the tabletop and how I'm going to build them. Honestly, I think that's going to be one of our next lore accurate list armies as well. I need to do some more deep diving on them and try and find a good book with their lore so that I can get to know them better. But they are a really, really fascinating historical reference as well. The Iron Warriors pull from a few different places, and there's a common trait when it comes to a lot of siege warfare throughout history, that is that the normal poor guy gets screwed. And that normal poor guy in Warhammer 40K, well, in Warhammer 30K especially, is the Iron Warriors. They are the thick, dense, heavy, you're not going to move us, but we're going to be able to slowly plod forward and push you back to your brink army. I love how the Iron Warriors are able to really embrace that trench warfare, siege warfare type style fighting. And it's really fascinating to see, especially in the Siege of Terra, how good they are at it. There's a couple points in history where this type of fighting becomes very prevalent. Obviously, the one we've already talked about a little bit is World War I on the Western Front. There's a lot of trench warfare, there's a lot of artillery, there's a lot of heavy equipment that's used as well. But this trait goes back to Rome and their siege engineer battalions. The English were also very good at this while fighting in France under Henry and during the Crusades. A lot of the armies of Islam were the same way. They were very, very good at digging in and beating the living daylights out of you, even though you're behind your own walls. And so there's a lot of different draws to really inspire the Iron Warriors. We see a lot of the Crusader nature, where they're there for a purpose and they're going to get it done no matter what. A lot of times during siege warfare, you would attrit a lot of your forces, or you would lose them to sickness, or they'd get bored and leave, or they'd defect because it sucks. Try camping for 24 months in northern France. You're camping through rain, you're camping through snow, you're camping through heat, you're camping through humidity, you're camping through a lot of bugs. You're probably getting dysentery because you're not getting clean water because the people inside the city are spoiling it for you. And the entire time you're having to work 19-hour days, either digging tunnels or loading catapults or using cannons that use very toxic versions of gunpowder and make you very sick. That is the Iron Warriors. Whether that be in 40K or 30K, that is who they are. And while in my daily grind I do kind of feel like this is me, I really enjoy what W Energy actually does for me to help me get through my days and accomplish my goals so that I can be iron within and iron without. Oh, sorry about that. Just enjoying a nice clean W Energy. It's our new sponsor on this channel that I'm super, super excited to have involvement with. They're a clean energy company that specializes in unique flavors and a bunch of different varieties of products. In the past, I've had some health problems in my life, and I've become very particular about what I take in. And unfortunately, in the energy world and in the hydration and electrolyte world, it's pretty hard to actually be super detailed without spending a ton of money. And that's why I enjoy W. They're a very clean and healthy alternative to your big energy drinks like Monster. But on top of that, they're actually designed with electrolytes. They also come with the electrolyte-specific version called W Hydro that is also a big part of what I take in. So I would definitely recommend checking them out at w.gg. And if you use code WARGAME, you can get 10% off any of your purchases. I also have a link down below in the description so you can go check out their starter pack. The next legion we're going to talk about is the Chaos Evangelists themselves, the Word Bearers. These pull from some specific times in history as well that were really, really fascinating to learn about and actually happened basically at the same time on two different parts of the world. And that is, first, the Spanish Inquisition. The Spanish Inquisition was a really fascinating time of purge and detailed search throughout the Catholic world to really bring everyone into one belief and one structure. We see this a lot with the rise of chaos throughout the Horus Heresy, with the purging of the legions on Isstvan III, but we also see their fighting styles over in the Middle East and North Africa and parts of Europe with the rise of Islam. During early Islam, they would preach and fight to capture a city. They would often use faith and Islam itself as a means to convert people to their side to help them get into cities. This is a technique that's used by the Word Bearers quite regularly and is something that's really fascinating to see reflected in Warhammer 40K. Throughout Chinese history, there's actually been several points that are referred to as something similar to the warlord periods. These are periods where different factions and sects team up to work together for certain goals. Sometimes this results in an emperor, sometimes it results in civil wars that last for a very long time. And this is the inspiration for the Black Legion. The Black Legion is a very unstable group of friends who are teaming up to work together because they have to. And this is very similar to the warlord periods. One of my favorites to learn about and study is actually right before World War II breaks out. China has broken into several different warlord factions. You have the Chinese nationalists, you have several different branches, like Tibet's on their own, Communist China is a small faction as well. And each of these factions has a slightly different structure and belief, but they're working together because there's a much bigger threat that they need to fight, and they need to maintain their goals. This is the Black Legion. The Black Legion is made up of those who don't fit in elsewhere, or people who have come from the Sons of Horus as their backbone, but they're also filled with people who have betrayed the Imperium from different loyalist factions. They're pulling in several different Thousand Sons, World Eaters, people who don't feel comfortable with their specific legions. Fabius Bile regularly works with them as well because he has issues with the Emperor's children. And we see this throughout the stories about the Black Legion themselves. They're very fascinating to see and to learn about because they often have to assemble and pull large groups together that don't get along, and then Abaddon has to point specific groups to go do specific things that they're good at that will aid the whole. So that's the historical inspiration for the Black Legion, which is our last one for today. I hope you guys have enjoyed this breakdown of history and the Warhammer 40k legions. If you have, make sure you give me a like and subscribe. We've got a lot of really cool stuff coming. So if you ring the little bell, you'll get notified of that coming up. On top of that, we do have a Patreon that is pretty new that you guys can join. The lowest tier gets you access to the videos early so you can enjoy them long before everyone else can. But the higher tiers have some really cool stuff as well. We have a chapter of Space Marines right up here called the Night Wardens that was developed with you guys' help on this channel. And if you join any of those higher tiers, you can become one of those Space Marines as well. We're going to figure out a cool way to show those off once we get enough of them named after you guys. So make sure you go check that out. All these links will be in the description below for Dubby and for vidIQ and my website where you can get really cool merch like the Readers That Wargame t-shirt. And I hope you guys have enjoyed this, and I will see you guys next week.